Hello. I would say we go on, and hello for the last two lectures tonight from Felix Stalder and Barok. And for the moment I'm very happy and glad to announce Felix Stalder, who is here actually for the second time in the Kunstverein, and the first time he was actually here in the context of the exhibition Post Capital from Daniel García and Andújar. So it was a kind of comparable context, but I'm sure he's not going to tell the same. Felix Stalder is professor for digital culture and hello? Yeah. So, Felix Stalder is professor for digital culture at the Zurich University of the Arts, a senior researcher at the World Information Institute in Vienna, and a moderator of NetTime, a critical nexus of the discourses on net culture since 1995. His work focuses on the intersection of cultural, political and technological dynamics, in particular on new models of common-based production, copyright and transformation of subjectivity. He's the author and editor of numerous books, among other Manuel Castells and the Theory of the Network Society in 2006, Deep Search, The Politics of Search Beyond Google, which was published in 2009, Digital Solidarity from 2014, and German title Kultur der Digitalität, which is going to be published soon. The recent publication talks and interviews are available at his website, felix.openflows.com, and I can highly recommend this. And the title of his lecture tonight is Knowledge for All, From Public to Free.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. And I don't think there is anyone who was here already 4 years ago, I think it was. But don't worry, because that was a horrible presentation. I think I ran at least an hour over time. So, and I had a lot of time, so it was epic. This time I'll try to be really brief, so we have some time for discussion, and since we are late, maybe we can make up a little bit of time. The first time that Marcel told me about his project, the public library, immediately I thought, but this isn't public, right? And so the public library is really a misnomer, and nobody than Marcel knows that, or nobody knows it better than him. So this is not a big kind of revelation that this is not a public library. But it's still, I think it's an interesting misnomer, because it shows some very large shifts in kind of the institutional setup of a knowledge structure. I have to look at the screen because these are actually my notes, but I can't see them here, so bear with me when I look at the screen. So to get to that misnomer or unpack why I think this is a misnomer, I want to make the detour through the subtitle of the conference, and I want to look at it from a point of view of infrastructures. And infrastructures are obviously very complex things. They have lots of different dimensions: material, legal, institutional, economics, and many more, but these are the ones I want to talk about. And I want to talk about particular infrastructures for an ideal of a knowledge order. So this is a kind of an aspirational vision of a knowledge order that has never been really achieved, but it's something that is interesting as a measure against which certain failures occur or distances that are still have to be covered. And in these infrastructures and these knowledge orders, embedded are particular social relations and subjectivities of the people acting and existing in these social relations. And the image, the ideal order that I want to talk about is knowledge for all. I don't really want to talk about what is knowledge or what is all, but this general vision, vague vision that people should have access to information, to knowledge, without problematizing any of these terms. And I want to look at the transformation of the of this particular kind of knowledge order, or the vision of this knowledge order from the point of view of the infrastructures that are necessary to produce that vision, however imperfectly they are in reality. So I take the transformation to occur between two ways of achieving that, that vision or going towards that vision. One is organized around the term public, and one is organized around the term free. I use these as kind of ideal types, so I'm not talking about very specific instances, because in every instance there are lots of contradictory and overlapping and forces, but I want to talk about them as ideal types, as abstractions, so that we see a bit more clearly what's at stake as we move from one order into another order, all under this heading or this idea that knowledge should be provided for all, which I totally subscribe to. These knowledge orders, they represent the uneasy settlement between what I would call a particular intellect, which is people in groups or individually producing certain things, and a general intellect, which is the wider culture in which they are embedded. And these two things are not really the same, but they are also not separable from one another. So there's a certain tension between the two. And the knowledge order, one of the things they do, they negotiate this tension between these two poles, between the particular and the general intellect. So the first knowledge order, public knowledge as an ideal of how to achieve knowledge for all, lasted roughly between 200 years, 1750 to 1980. The dates are always a bit arbitrary, but you can use some markers to get an idea. 1750 obviously is the encyclopedia. I was a bit, I already thought whether I should change it after I just saw Dusan's presentation where he pointed at the encyclopedia from 1728, but still it's not that far. I'm not about kind of precise dates, but these are periods. So this is an important moment when one knowledge order, usually based around secrets and around guilds and other forms of knowledge production that shielded the access to knowledge very, very strictly, was transformed into another knowledge order around public. The idea that this knowledge should be accessible through the ideas of the public, was coming up as part of the new social structures brought about by the Enlightenment. And it ends perhaps in the 1980s with something like this. This is a TV series that ran in the late 1970s in England. It's called Yes Minister, and its sequel was called Yes Prime Minister. And it was this TV series that mainly consisted of ridiculing any idea that there is something like public service, the public good, and these were all just cynically provided covers for personal aspirations and bureaucratic infighting. So any idea that something was provided as a public service, with the idea of the public, was ridiculed, and not surprisingly, Margaret Thatcher was one of the keen admirers of this idea of this TV series where it said, its closely observed portrayal of what goes on in the corridors of power has given me hours of pure joy. And this was the destruction, the delegitimation of the idea of the public, the public servants and all of that. So you can maybe take these two as randomly chosen, but roughly within a certain period as the establishment of an idea and kind of the destruction of an idea. So the first order is within this historical period. So again, these are these dimensions. And the materiality of the knowledge object, so to speak, in this order, were high-volume physical media. So basically books, printed pamphlets, newspapers, and all of that. and the entire infrastructure that was necessary to produce them, publishing houses, printers, paper industry, the whole distribution networks and all of that. But it was centered around creating and distributing these high volume, kind of industrially produced thousands and thousands of identical objects, physical objects, kind of immutable mobile. So they were fixed things that were very mobile and made mobile through these infrastructures. And through particular legal regimes that on the one hand created the immutability, and on the other hand the mobility. So they were basically copyrights and patents, two ways of ensuring that things enter into the public but are then described to a particular owner that can determine or keep them immutable while they are circulating as commodities. So the particular legal infrastructure, a legal layer on top of that to kind of support certain elements of the material infrastructure and vice versa. So these infrastructures and these regimes, they had a territorial and a temporal limit, and outside that limit was either kind of again the private domain because it wasn't published there, or it was the public domain. So the particular legal regime ended, and also the immutability ended because then people could do with these objects whatever they wanted to do. But it was territorially and temporally limited. That's the important part of it. And there was an outside to that order. So there were two kind of fundamental regimes operating. One was the regime of private property, and the other one was the regime of public access. And this was embedded in particular kind of institutional settings. We, on the one hand, had very broadly speaking the cultural industries that were producing private property, and you had public institutions, the public library in the kind of traditional sense, that were providing public access to that. And there was a settlement of how these different orders and actors could interact and coexist. So as I said, these are kind of the concrete actors, institutional actors in that, and there were several ways of accessing the knowledge encased in these different institutions, where either you could go and buy it, or one could refer to some kind of a human right or a citizen right to have access to these public institutions. And an inhabitant of Stuttgart will have a right to go to the public library just as a right of a citizen or an inhabitant of a particular region. So there were two ways of accessing and negotiating these regimes, right? And one was organized obviously towards profits, and the other was finance. There were different economies involved, even though a lot of the actors in the cultural industry are not very profitable, but they still operate under the pressures of a regime that is organized towards profit, and if they don't reach a certain minimum, they're not going to survive. Or we have publicly funded or quasi-publicly funded organizations. As I say quasi-publicly funded because a lot of public funding is actually kind of, particularly in the Anglo context, private money, it's foundations, all of that, but they provide a similar function to create institutions that operate quasi-publicly, again, on this idea that as a citizen or a human being, you have the right to use them for whatever, on whatever conditions they set. Right? So any order has also an outside of it. So there are certain knowledge domains that were not regulated by this or escaped, so were either not integrated or escaped this knowledge order. And it was on the one hand informal knowledge, so things that were circulating without ever entering into one of those immutable mobiles, but they were circulating between people as traditional knowledge, as informal knowledge about particular situation, and occasionally, or very often actually, historically, illegal copies, so these things escaped the property regime or escaped one particular element of the property regime, the copyright in this case, and entered into other forms of circulation that have historically been extremely important as a way of making this knowledge order kind of spread, even though they were formally speaking outside of it, at least legally. So embedded in all of this were very particular relationships and subjectivities. This is fairly well known. So you had a small number of authors, you have a small number of works, you have large audiences that somehow or publics constituted by that. So it's a very particular, also a linear progression from the author to the work to the audience, and each of these elements have a very clear idea of what it is to be an author, what it is to be a reader, to be the audience, and how to behave and what to expect, and how to project oneself into a particular situation in that. But it was a very clear, linear kind of set of relationships. That is a number of values attached to that. There was obviously individuality, which is still the mark of whether something reaches copyright-worthy status or not. If it's not individual, it's not copyrightable, so it's not within that regime. That's why animals cannot produce copyrighted work, or machines cannot produce copyrighted works. There was obviously the idea of originality, so there was a certain sense of being always at the beginning of something new. This was also the idea of why you could claim property over it, because you were the beginning of, it was kind of coming out of you, of your own work, rather than relying on others. And with that was a certain idea of innovation, that this new was not just new, it was better. So that's another aspect of why there's a property, or the argument for a property relation underneath it. So it was embedded, obviously, in the grand narrative of history, so you could mark all kinds of breaks that the new would introduce, but it was still a historical progression and progress, rather. And knowledge appeared as representation, and with the question of representation, obviously, always comes the question of misrepresentation. So a lot of the discussions about the knowledge in this particular order was about whether or not the representation was accurate, or whether or not it reflected the complexities of the situation and all of that. So, but knowledge was mainly viewed as something about the world, as something that represented certain aspects of the world, and the question of whether that representation fit or not was one of the main kind of avenues of critique and debate, also about how to develop the knowledge in order to make the representation better, or represent different aspects of all of that. So the area of free knowledge, as opposed to public knowledge, roughly, if you want the date, started in 1984, if you want one. That's basically when the GNU General Public License was published, and that codified and gave that a very distinct idea, a distinct shape. Obviously, you can go further back in history, then you end, or will pass at some point, Lautréamont, with the idea of plagiarism, and I'm sure that historians of ideas can go much further than that. But you can, I think 1984 is good enough as an approximation of where this starts, mainly because it gets a distinct shape that is relevant today, and kind of sets a certain set of ground rules about what free knowledge is supposed to be. Again, these are all these dimensions that also these types of knowledge has. So the materiality is, these are high velocity digital media with all the necessary infrastructures that go around. from computers to telecommunications to data centers to you know, the global supply chain that manufactures all these things from mines in Congo to workers in Taiwan into our pockets and all of that. But the effects of that is the production of high velocity and very quickly circulating digital media. And what you get is circulating mutables. So you have all kinds of things that are defined by the fact that they circulate and that are unstable, that they can change shape all the time. So the legal regimes are about how to organize the circulation and how to organize the mutability of these objects. So we basically have two kind of prototypical ways of organizing. One is the NDA, the non-disclosure agreement, which basically creates secrets, group secrets, so certain knowledge that cannot go over a border. And we have free licenses, on the other hand, that set a certain ground rules for free knowledge. But these are the two main ways we have today to organize circulation and transformation of knowledge. Obviously, we have lots of others, but these are the ones that are closely connected with the idea of free. So either it's secret, or it is free in a sense that people can do whatever they want with it. I'm not claiming that everything is under a free license, but a lot of things that are available are actually copyrighted, but people don't care. They treat it as it was free in this loose sense of I can do with it what I want. But on the other hand, we have a big area of secrecy growing around that. What we no longer have is this idea that you can put something out there and then control it as it flows through society, the way you control a commodity as it moves from through different areas in the market space. So either you try to avoid publication at any cost, or you basically enter into a realm where control is very, very difficult. And the old regimes to create these immutable mobiles are still with us, obviously. Things rarely die completely, but they are no longer kind of the defining framework for knowledge production, particularly in this context. So these are temporally and spatially limitless. It's very different from the old. So they basically are forever, and they are everywhere. One of the big problems that a lot of, for example, filmmakers have with free licenses is precisely this. Once you put it out, there's no way you ever get it back. It renews itself with every usage, so it lasts forever. And it's perpetual and global. The same thing tends to be with non-disclosure agreements. They rarely have an end, and they usually, you're not allowed, they never are spatially limited. It's not that you cannot talk about this in the US, but you can in Europe. This is not the way these things work. They are also forever and for everywhere. So it's a long now and a great here. So you have two institutional sets that produce knowledge in this case. It's either a closed organization or an open community. I put community in brackets simply because I don't want to talk about what a community is. But it's something else than a closed organization. Right? And you have two economic ways of producing that. Either one is a highly personalized service, or it's kind of a self-production. People who want it need to do it themselves in some way or another. It's not provided as a service, but also here kind of the commodity form is kind of moving a bit into the background, and you have two kind of relational ways of producing that knowledge order. So you have different relationships. You have either a provider-user relationship, where the provider sets the terms of use that we all click on all the time, or you have kind of a co-producer system where you can no longer really distinguish easily between the producer and the user because they are interrelated in complex and intimate ways that it doesn't really make sense to differentiate that in a strict way. Sure, there are in certain moments people that tend to produce more and people that tend to use more, but these are no longer fixed categories. It's very fluid, and it's kind of a situated decision. Okay, today I want to produce, and there's nothing really to restrict me, or today I don't want to do anything, or in this area I don't want, or in that area. So I'm using lots of free software. I could write some, but I can't, and I don't want to. But it's nothing in the same way that restricts me from doing that, other than my personal interest, than it was in another regime where it's clear separation, and there are fixed borders, there are legally and technically enforced borders. In the co-producer way, this is much more fluid, to the degree that it sometimes doesn't make sense to make the distinction at all. Right, and how do you access these knowledge audits? Either you access through markets or through community membership. So you have to be part of a community to access the knowledge that is inside this community. In the digital context, this community membership on the access part is relatively light. You just have to click on the I agree, kind of the license, or you do that implicitly. There's usually not a click on it, but when you dig down, it says by using this you accept the terms of the GPL or something like this. But the community membership question becomes more important when you think about this. These are not just users, but these are co-producers. So in the moment you start to be a producer, the question of your position and your membership in the community becomes much more relevant and much more complicated than simply copying it, which is not a big deal, obviously, in a digital context. So the co-production is very much predicated on your being part of the community, also having access to the space, the knowledge space, and the resources organized within this community. Right? And there are different motives for the production of either one or the other element of the knowledge audits. Either, classic still, the profit motive is very strong still, obviously, or something like community interest. We talked about this already yesterday. Communities tend to produce what is of interest to them. Right, we heard this very emphatically yesterday, expressed by Sebastian, who said, how could you be so stupid hiring a programmer who doesn't use the program he produces, right? So this sense that is very much centered around the producers who fulfill their own needs, and hopefully other people have that too, but if not, then not that bad for producers because their own needs. So it's not necessarily individual needs, but kind of negotiated in communities, but very much about what these communities think is important. Right? So you have also part of the order that belongs to that order, kind of the free and secret knowledge order that produces as an aspirational idea this idea of free knowledge. And so one is the leak that brings kind of secret knowledge that is hidden underneath all kinds of layers of non-disclosure agreements and other ways of preventing it to circulate more freely into the public. We've seen a lot of these lately, and I think it's not a coincidence because this is part of how this knowledge system is organized. And we have kind of other ways of creating kind of semi-secret knowledge in shadow libraries and close sharing communities, private trackers, and all of that. And since we're in Germany, it's important to mention the word depublication, which I think is particular kind of German weirdness that public broadcasters need to depublish their material after 7 days, so they can 7 days after broadcasting they can put it online, and after 7 days they need to take it away again, which is weird, but has complex lobbying reasons, obviously. But this is also part of the thing, so we should not expect things to just add up automatically. Things also disappear sometimes because certain actors are forced to depublish, otherwise sometimes also because people who maintain archive, we heard a lot about that, said enough is enough and they pull the plug and things disappear. So this is also part of this knowledge order that things disappear quickly. There are many studies how quickly kind of material disappears, and this, when you take this against this background of this idea that the internet never forgets, the internet forgets a lot of things all the time. So disappearance of knowledge is an essential part of that knowledge order again. And so again here we are embedded in these relations and particular sets of social relations, and I try to do that in a somewhat complicated graphic representation, if you want to call that graphic, because it's not that linear anymore. So you have communities or teams, they do certain things, they select, they transform, which means they add or subtract or process, and they reproduce. So the act, we also heard that today, kind of the performative element of that, the need to reproduce these things constantly in order to keep them alive and keep them as actual knowledge rather than some quasi objects in a kind of zombified state in the archive. And this goes around shared materials as the basis to do that. When you remember yesterday, Cornelia kind of quoted or referred to this definition of the commons that maps very easily onto that. So shared materials would be the resources, selection, transformation, reproduction would be kind of the commoning, and the communities would be the commonness. But I prefer to write it this way because this is a much more general way of doing this. I would expect, I suspect, I don't know, but I suspect that you could also, a lot of kind of knowledge production in the NSA map on that. And this is why someone like Edward Snowden, because of the shared materials, could get so much. And this was an explicit kind of realization after 9/11 that they had all the information in silos, as how they call it, and now they want to share it. Obviously within boundaries of the organization, but you could map something like this very similar onto internal processes of lots of firms. And one of the reasons why commons, in my view, have such a kind of a renaissance is because they also map very well onto that. But this kind of is more basic, more general than commons as a particular social kind of a particular social order or a particular set of social institutions. This is kind of a more general way of how knowledge is organized and produced. Right? So within that, knowledge is evaluated either according to usefulness, so we don't have the representation part anymore, or to community values. Right? Often these two are related, obviously. One who thinks what is useful has something to do with community values, but not everything is useful in this software sense, but a lot of other things are evaluated along the line of community values. Is this what interests us? These are the references that we think are important, and things other outside of that is either boring or trivial, or talk about this somewhere else. So these are two very important ways of kind of evaluating this type of knowledge produced inside these systems. And knowledge is no longer seen as knowledge as representation, but knowledge as participation. So who produces this? And immediately, the same way that you have with representation, you get the problem of misrepresentation. With participation, you get the problem of lack of participation. So who's actually producing that? Right, so we have these two public versus free produce very different kinds of questions. Like the first case, the question is whose world can appear? So what is being made visible, what is being represented, what is inside the kind of the sphere of the public, what kind of knowledge, what kind of experiences, what kind of information, what kind of practices can appear there. Right? There's traditionally if you take the newspaper example, there are people who make these decisions. No, this is not news fit to print, right? The way the New York Times puts it. So this was the question of which news are fit to print, and someone deciding that, and all the critique about their work and the processes that go into that. But in the other regime, this is no longer so much the question, because there's a multiplicity of worlds that appear everywhere. It's more the question of who's making the world. So who's actually contributing, who's actually involved in the process of making all these things, making these worlds, making these many different worlds. So this is a very ambiguous kind of situation, because on the one hand, it's actually, I think, a real increase in freedom and the ability to make different worlds. Right? We talked. It was in the panel before. I think Vuk said that he's interested in people making something rather than, you know, how they engage with kind of the larger system. So, and this ability clearly has increased. So people can make their own world to varying degrees under varying circumstances. But obviously that comes at a certain price, or has the danger of coming with a certain price. And I called them kind of self-centeredness, fragmentation, and disappearance. And by self-centeredness, I mean this tendency of communities to look inwards. They have to organize their own world. It's a difficult task, and they have to keep themselves together. And they are focused on their own interests and need to provide a certain coherent frame of references in order to be existent as a community and as an organism, as the capacity to make a world in the first place. This obviously leads to the danger of fragmentation, that these worlds are increasingly insular, become increasingly, as they differentiate their own world, the difference to other world increases. And this is actually part of the way you build your own world, by distinguishing it from others. And the more comprehensive this world becomes, the more fragmented kind of the overall, what used to be the public, as a kind of an integrated framework where everyone, simply by being a human being, ideally, had the right to enter and to be taken seriously according to certain metrics, at least, you know, be able to vote if you are a citizen within a unified plane. This is the danger of it being replaced by enormous fragmentation. And the consequence of fragmentation is disappearance. So it's very easy in this system for things to disappear, people to disappear, entire landscapes to disappear, and because everyone is in their own world, and what is outside of this world is very hard to recognize. And basically, if you look at this from a network theory point of view, networks cannot extend beyond their own reach, right? So either something is in the network and it's part of the world of the network, or it's structurally invisible. And this is something that there's a real danger, and a lot of political and economic developments work on top of that. So in the sense of suddenly there are entire countries and population that are superfluous. So we don't need them, so whatever. And this is directly related to a particular way of acting and perceiving the world. Right? So the question, I think, from a political point of view is, how do you make the free public? Right? So how do you go against these tendencies of free knowledge and free communities, while preserving some of the things that actually make them really interesting and make them, I think, also imbue them with a lot of kind of emancipatory potential, and not just potential, but a kind of really actually realized emancipation. And so one of the things, I think Femke talked about that, is the question of how do you increase the diversity. When I wrote the slides, I was writing diverse communities. I think, no, this is structurally impossible. This is part of the communities that's not diverse. So I add more diverse to it. And I also think that, we all don't know how much diversity these communities can support. We know that their natural tendency is not towards too much diversity. But maybe we can stretch that. We'll see what out of this code of conduct comes out, and a lot of similar experiences. But I think also it's not that problematic, because we are in this situation where there's the possibility of making a lot of different communities. So this is not necessarily only one and everyone needs to fit into that, except in cases where it is like that, right? So if you want to write a freely accessible encyclopedia, there's basically only one community, right? And if you don't fit, tough luck. So these are really difficult problems that sometimes can be solved or can be kind of ameliorated by diversity, but they also, it cannot always be solved by, do your own thing. Sometimes they can, sometimes not. So the next question is then what I call here bridges, is how do you make sure that knowledge flows from one to the other? So if you recognize that there is a certain sense, a certain kind of also positive quality towards a certain insularity between these different communities, and that they really can develop their own world, how it's good for them. The question is, how do you avoid fragmentation while keeping this potential for diversity? And then is the question of how do you make bridges between these communities. How to do that, I have no idea. So that's why I stop here. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Now we have two microphones. That's something.
All right, curators have both microphones.
Well, thanks a lot. I would maybe start with one point. If I think about the public and about diversity, it's maybe I would not put the term bridge, but conflict, actually. So for me, this is the area of negotiations through conflict. That means you have all these, let's say, self-centered communities, and the diversity is maybe not so much within those communities, but in this conflict between the different communities, which in my idea would produce something like the public or a public space.
Yeah. Could I add? Sure. Yeah, sure. Because I also would. Then we can make this kind of ping pong. Because I was also saying, what is the when you say conflict, when you say instead of diversity, you say dissent. When you say instead of fragmentation, you say segregation. This is a different kind of a terminology which describes this what you gives it. Then you don't bridge. You stay with the conflict.
Actually, I think bridge is a better term than conflict. And the reason being, also this idea that out of this conflict you produce the public in this kind of traditional sense of kind of a unified frame of reference that people relate to. I think this gets increasingly more difficult, and the problem is not so much that the people or these communities don't agree with one another, and now we have to find ways to kind of manage or make productive these disagreements or these dissents, but that they increasingly become structurally invisible to one another. So we see this also in a sense of kind of general kind of tolerance. You can do whatever you want as long as you don't need to see it. So this, I think, I'm not suggesting that there are no conflicts. There are obviously lots of conflicts inside these communities and also sometimes between these communities. But the tendency of these, at least between communities, is that they simply don't see each other. And that they develop very, very distinct and sometimes very sophisticated and for us very interesting or very boring ways of describing the world. But these terms become, as they lose kind of this idea that there's a common reference for all these different communities, because they need to make their own kind of referential space. This idea of a kind of productive conflict, you need to have this joint or this shared set of references. I don't say they totally disappear. Obviously, we live in the same physical world, and that creates a certain way of a minimum of kind of a shared referential space. But it becomes increasingly difficult to talk about this as that. That's what that's why I think first we need bridges in order for knowledge and culture to flow, and then we'll see where the conflicts arise, and maybe if then a conflict arises, we have one that already has a certain discursive quality rather than just things mutually illegible colliding with one another.
Thank you, that was very useful. I have many questions, but because I'm thinking that maybe even in free culture we have seen a shift from, let's say there's a gradient going from thinking about knowledge production sort of still with references to the public, to now I think we have a different type of free culture. And I think the popularity of the fork is one signifier of that. Like where in early days to fork a project was seen as a problem, like to split apart when a project had internal problems they couldn't solve. Free software licenses would allow the community to split without losing the project. It was a kind of safety mechanism that was very in the early days only in extreme cases being put to use. Where now the fork is the opposite. The fork is the first thing you do, which means that once something doesn't work, you just go on your own copy, which means like a complete fracturing of projects. I mean, I'm dramatizing a bit, but so this I think we see also within free culture. We see different ways of dealing, or different practices around bridges happen. So, but anyway, my question was a word you didn't use in this presentation, and was in the title, surprisingly for me, of one of your last books, was solidarity.
Mm-hmm.
So could you maybe say something about your use of the term bridge in relation to your use of the term solidarity when you talk about, because the title of the book was Digital Solidarity.
Yeah.
So is that a bridge?
No, it's not. It's not a bridge. Or maybe it is. I don't know. What I meant is that for a long time, in particular, accelerated through neoliberalism, there was this idea of society kind of atomizing, and everyone is their own little kind of robot in the market, optimizing their own advantages, and the idea was that the experience of kind of established civil society, institutions, churches, associations, unions, and all of that, that provided a certain glue would fall apart, and you had all these atomized individuals, bowling along kind of thing. And well, this is obviously still going on, and it was always seen that kind of an increased sense of individuality would go against the sense of community. So it was this kind of classic liberal problem: either you're an individual or you're part of society, and there's a problematic trade-off between them, right? So you have to give it a little bit of your liberty, or your individuality, to become a part of society. So this was the sense that was clearly shifting in one direction. And what struck me and what is that in kind of digital communities, you see a sense of a new mixture between the experience of individuality, because you're an individual producer and making yourself visible in these communities, but also a sense of that your own individuality and your own expression of your personality could not happen outside the space that the community provides, because otherwise your great programming tricks are illegible to anyone else. So you need that community in order to establish yourself as a kind of a singular person, right? So there's no longer this sense that these are two poles and you move between them, but they're intertwined in interesting new ways. And that increasingly the experience of the knowledge, also free knowledge, is one of not knowing, right? There's almost nobody that has a sense that they are in full command of the knowledge of anything, right? So even if you're very, very specialized, there's the sense of that you don't know kind of your domain, and I mean, artists make a living out of that, but for a lot of people this is a kind of a problematic experience. So one of the ways of dealing with that is to kind of move kind of reflective capacity onto communities. So you don't know, but chances are you can find someone who knows. So this is another sense when on a very deep kind of everyday level that there's a different experience emerging of how to relate to other people in your neighborhood, and how to create again a sense of a shared experience and a shared, destiny is perhaps a bit too much, but something that out of which a sense of solidarity can grow. So for me this was primarily within these communities in the framework here. This is kind of the glue that keeps them together and also makes them surprisingly long-lasting sometimes. I mean, we tend to think of these as ephemeral, but many of them are not. We just maybe don't see them anymore because we drop out, but they're lot of things keep existing. I mean, I've been involved in a particular community that is now about 20 years old. And over that time, a lot of things have changed, but this has stayed relatively stable, surprisingly stable, still the same people basically. So a bit like here. But there is a sense of these communities providing something together in solidarity in a way that is necessary for each of them in order to do what it is that they want, right? So it's an experience that you cannot separate your own aspirations from the aspirations of the group, even though they're not the same necessarily. But it's not, okay, I can do this and I can, you know, outrun them and then I'll be there and they're still kind of leave them in dust. That doesn't work in this situation. That's where this idea of a new experience on top of which you perhaps could build kind of solidarity or can experience solidarity in a highly individualized and kind of diversified situation. That is, that diversification is not necessarily leading to kind of this atomized, kind of automized market situation. That's what's the idea.
Thank you for great systematization, first of all. You've described public and free as paradigms. So what you're mapping is a paradigmatic change. But I would say that free might be more at a level of a tendency, historic tendency, within a circumscribed context that continues still to have the public. So my question would be, and I think that is really the critical question, is how we can reinsert some of the normative ideas that are enshrined in the practice of the free. One is creation that is adequate to the needs and capacities. Other one would be the commodified economy of access. So how do we reinsert those within the public that, in my understanding, is circumscribed? I already talked about this like 2 days ago, I think, where public is, on the one hand, limited by the stability of the political system, and on the other hand, on the stability of the conditions for accumulation, so for the economy to be basically growing and that there would be tax revenue to sustain the public institutions. No. So my question would be, where do you see any ways of inserting the free into the public so as to move the public out of that limited remit that it has, so with the permission of the state and with the permission of the capital. I think that if there is a lesson to learn from the cry for the commons, it's that one. Like, how can we go back to the notion of the realm of needs and uncommodified satisfaction of those, and reinsert some collective ownership over the resources, yet keep the principle of universal access. Mm-hmm. Because that's definitely where commons fail, unless you are envisioning something where there is no universal provider of access, so where there is no, ultimately, the state or the substrate of the state. You know? But that seems like far-fetched.
Yeah. No, I would agree. I think that commons fail on that level. Kind of strictly speaking, to your question, the answer would be no. But I think if you turn it around, it becomes very interesting. So for me, it's less the question, how can we insert the free into the public, but the other way around. How can we use certain elements that were used to produce the public, right? For example, certain non-market ways of financing, and kind of orient these means towards the production of the free, that you have then a better chance also to think about kind of more complex, perhaps institutional questions that would allow for diversity and bridges and all of that. But I think the other way around, it gets extremely complicated, simply because the way these institutions have already solidified, or maybe even ossified, it's very, very difficult to change these. And at the moment, the basis from which to change them, and politically speaking, is just very weak. Right? So there's not like a very kind of strong and diverse movement of commons that can now make demands towards the state. It's very, very hard. I think we're seeing that slowly, and the area where I see that the most is the demands for access to data, open data, where you really say, look, these are public institutions, this stuff is theoretically public, but we need to provide it in another format so we can actually use it within the context of free. So I see this a little bit happening, but I think this is extremely difficult simply because of the way these institutions are solidified and the relative weakness to make demands towards these institutions. So I hope we get to that point where you can do that.
Just a short remark. I think it's interesting to look outside of the realm of digital commons, no? And there have been attempts at recommunalization of resources which have tried to devise different strategies of sort of communal ownership or commoner ownership of public services. No? It is an attempt that is maybe questionable at some level, but I think it's interesting attempt. You know, for instance, like the most commonly used example is the deprivatization of the water in Naples with Acqua Bene Comune, where they're trying to set up a framework, legal framework, where the public would be represented through communities, through experts, and then through political structures only in the third place, and not vice versa. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of these things going on. Naples is one of the most advanced. Also been in Germany, in Berlin, there was a vote whether to have a communal power grid, and it was kind of extremely close. And 80% or something like this who voted actually said yes, we want that, but the overall quota was not reached by a fraction of a percent. So it didn't happen, but there's a clear sense of that it's possible to do institutions differently. There are different experiences. It's also this entire push towards non-representative forms of democracy is coming out of a different lived everyday experience, that you can do things differently, that you can have other forms of involvement, knowledge as participation rather than representation, and also that on a political level. So I think there's a lot of things happening, and I think it's actually really exciting. I mainly wanted to point out that in that shift that underlies this is a very big kind of shift in infrastructures, and very complex infrastructures. And it runs into some real difficult internal problems that we have to deal with in order not to let them run amok. But I mean, it's always the case. I think these are interesting problems, versus while other problems are boring problems, I'm happy to change interesting problems for boring problems. So I'm happy with that, but the problems won't go away.
Okay. Maybe to make one last. 1984 was the year when the first neoliberal economic system collapsed in Chile and the strike in Great Britain were lost. And when we speak about free and public, this is very clearly, in my opinion, that for this freedom we're speaking about, a lot of people lost their freedom in the meantime. We make a fresh air break, and then we go on.